Hey everybody, long time no see. This is Brett, the lead artist at Studio Hipsword, and this is the first ever dev vlog for our new indie game, The Siege of Jeomdo. So real quick, what is The Siege of Jeomdo? It is a branching narrative game, similar to Citizen Sleeper or Road Warden if you've played those, where your choices shape the story in various different directions. Aesthetically, it's very inspired by the Choson dynasty and East Asian culture in general. You take the role of Dujum, an ex-war tactician who has retired to a peaceful island village called Jeomdo. However, that peace is uprooted when the Gonchurian Empire shows up to conquer your new home. So you're thrust back into leadership, and you've got to work together with the peaceful townsfolk to mount a defense against, like, the scariest war force in the world. That's an okay summary, I think. But we can get more into the nitty-gritty of the game later. The topic of this video is actually more of a recap of how we landed on this game concept to begin with. So if you're interested in this game's very early history, stick around. So back in February of 2022, we released our first ever proper indie game, Hipwitch. We ended up releasing it for free as it was sort of an unpolished learning experience for us. And honestly, it did a lot better than we even imagined. We racked up over 20k downloads on Steam and 119 reviews with a very positive rating. To anyone who played our game, shared our game, left a review, did a let's play, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. But of course, we did end the experience thinking, what's next for Studio Hipsword? Well, pretty quickly we knew a few things. First of all, we wanted a new game to be more ambitious in scope than Hipwitch. We wanted something that felt fully featured and worth selling for real money. And we needed a banger concept that we were really excited about that would help carry us throughout development motivation-wise. But to come up with a game concept that truly captured all of those conditions, we needed something that we didn't have for Hipwitch, some actual time set aside for pre-production. Actually, a lot of time. Last time we figured out what Hipwitch was as we were making it, and we wanted to avoid that this time around. So we started by getting everyone in the team to pitch various different game ideas. Here's just a small handful of the pitches we came up with. This idea comes from Sailor. This is Quinn's Arrow. This would have been a simple 2D platformer starring an androgynous elf with a bow and arrow. You could shoot these arrows into walls and then jump off of them, and you'd generally be trying to outrun some sort of force like a monster or maybe an avalanche. Kind of like if Celeste and Volgar the Viking had a baby. I'll be honest, I mostly decided to show off this pitch because I wanted to show off this epic key art from Jensen. I'd say we probably didn't pick this idea because it felt a little bit generic. Here's another one of my favorites. Connect 4, but crazy. This was one of Jensen's ideas. I really love the thought of taking a classic game and then doing some ridiculous video gamey thing to it. Kind of like what Mario Tennis is compared to regular tennis. I do also love this excerpt from the presentation. Does this work? Like, as a game? I sure hope so. I've thought about it for a couple hours and it seems fine, but also I have a brain injury. Alright, the rest of the dev team is currently letting me know that I should not spend the entire video talking about games we didn't make. So I'll just leave this segment off by saying, we could have made a golf game. Check this out, we had a playable demo and everything. It was like Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy meets golf. But someone else kind of beat us to it, so whatever. If there's interest, maybe one day in the future we can make a video going into more of the pitches in more detail, but for now, let's move on to the pitch that actually won us over. Defend the Village. This was a narrative-focused pitch inspired by Akira Kurosawa's 1954 classic, Seven Samurai. There is something compelling about the story of a group of samurai not only protecting a small village from bandits, but teaching the people how to work together to defend themselves through solidarity and clever tactics. Sailor saw the potential in gamifying this plot structure, putting the player into the driver's seat of the story arc. The pressure of everyone looking to you as their leader seemed a natural fit for light strategy game elements, and especially the kinds of role-playing dilemmas you might find in Telltale's The Walking Dead. Which tactic should we use? What if we're going too far? What are we willing to sacrifice? Foregoing the Japanese theming, we instead took more inspiration from Korean history, as it's a bit less represented in the gaming space. The Admiral Roaring Currents is another film that influenced the game, featuring another underdog battle helmed by historical Korean naval commander Yi Sun-sin. In fact, much of this guy's portrayal in the movie found its way into our protagonist, Doo-jin. So, we actually tried out a few different art styles. Given our game has a fantasy setting inspired by Asian cultures, you probably won't be surprised to learn we looked at replicating Ghibli or Avatar. But perhaps you didn't expect us to play around with lo-fi pixel art or even some Mobius. Ultimately, we ended up with an art style somewhere between my own natural style and the works of Tim McBurney, taking inspiration from his earthy textures like chalky red brushes and bold flat colors that allow breezy, flowing line work to sing. I'll stop myself before I go overboard. So we had a premise and an art style, but how was all this supposed to work in a gameplay sense? This is the part of the project that ultimately had to change most drastically from the pitch, and you'll see why in a minute, but here's how it started. From the beginning, we knew the game would be split into two modes. Village gameplay, in which the player prepared defenses, trained warriors, and got to know the townspeople, and battles, in which players fought enemies in strategic turn-based combat, with stats, items, and circumstances varying depending on your prep from the village gameplay. Chuck on a couple of Walking Dead-style narrative branches, and you've got a plan, right? Well, as you can see, we did start building this version of the game. The village gameplay section originally looked like a sort of side-scroller you could run around in like an RPG. With combat, we played around with a multitude of ideas. Standard JRPG combat with two parties standing next to each other, taking turns hitting each other, felt kind of wrong for the guerrilla theme of the underdog versus the oppressor. Something more positioning-based seemed to make sense. But we learned from Ashes, our failed game project from 2020, that the whole full-on tactical grid-style gameplay required a huge art push. That's how we landed on this left and right lane system you see here. But even this, especially coupled with the village gameplay, was arguably too big of a scope increase from our previous project, Hipwitch. Not to mention this lane system was proving to be quite difficult to design for anyway. And then like an intelligent AI would need to control all the enemies, it's a lot. It will always be really hard to keep project scope in check because as creatives, we're always going to want to bite off more than we can chew because we're imaginative. But this was looking pretty ambitious, even assuming everything went well. And assuming no sudden plot twists swooped in and suddenly changed our lives and turned our worlds upside down. And then there was the twist. It was around this point that Reese, one of the co-founders of Studio Hipsword, lead programmer on all of our games up until this point, realized he wanted to pursue a different career path outside of game development. Not only was he planning to leave Studio Hipsword, but even move countries for an entirely fresh start. This was kind of a big deal, to say the least. It's a bittersweet thing to watch a lifelong friend do what's best for them when that means parting ways. Now, luckily, we'd already started onboarding two new programmers, Heinrich and Kenneth, but our plans were destabilized. We only had Reese a bit longer and weren't sure to what extent our relatively new team members were willing to rise up and helm the project. With the long-term future of our studio uncertain, we had all the impetus we needed to radically rethink what Defend the Village was. What followed was many hours of concepting and brainstorming our game's new form before putting together a proof-of-concept prototype to make sure it was actually compelling. Let's go over what changed from the original version to the prototype. The most general sweeping change was to switch to a more visual novel-like format across the board, putting a focus on writing. Starting with the village gameplay, did we really need to control a character walking around the environment to roleplay a leader prepping for war? We decided to switch to an overhead view of the village and have the player simply click on whichever location they want to visit, triggering a written scene filled with interesting prose and character interactions relating to the upcoming conflicts. Often you'll get a dialogue choice that either branches the story or simply allows you to express yourself. Having a limited pool of actions per in-game day means the player needs to prioritize which plans to invest in. Kinda like a tactician. This approach is not only far easier to produce than what we originally had in mind, but probably better suited to the game's theme. You can imagine backtracking to important locations every in-game day would get annoying fast. And the overhead view of the village immediately gives me a strategic vibe. Citizen Sleeper was a huge influence on this revamp, showing how light resource management can turn a collection of scenes into something dynamic and addictive. The combat gameplay arguably underwent the biggest change under the direction shift, but I think we came up with something quite engaging. It doesn't feel so much like a concession to me. At its core, combat plays out like your basic story scenes, but with much higher production values and stakes. Instead of the standard art, we get a whole heap of more cinematic art pieces depicting the action in glorious detail. You're given strategic choices to make at key points during the battle, which branch the scenario in different directions. This can lead to long-reaching story consequences, like character deaths. And like before, resources gathered and choices made during the village gameplay affect your options and outcomes here. Given the huge amount of art and writing required to make these work, there's only going to be a handful of these in the final game, punctuating each major arc in the story. So, all that redesigning and reworking led to the first ever prototype build, which you've been watching during this segment. While the first wave of playtesters were mostly people who know and love us, our feedback survey results were promising. Although a bit undercooked and certainly underpolished, the core game loop and story premise were genuinely engaging. It meant a lot to know we were onto something that could potentially be a really good game. We just needed to keep digging until we finally unearthed it for real. So, what's been happening since? Well, we've been hard at work turning the prototype into a real game. For starters, we've overhauled much of what we had. The script has been entirely restarted with a full game, themes, and world building in mind. UI and several backgrounds are brand new. We're also layering on a bunch of new stuff, including new game mechanics and visuals to improve mechanical depth and immersion respectively. Learning how to pitch our game for funding particularly helped us nail down our vision even further. Actually landing the funding would have been cool too, but you know, can't win them all. Mostly we're just chipping away at content. Plenty of scenes to write, characters to design, battles to draw, music to compose, features to program. Such is the life of a dev. So that's pretty much the history of the game formerly known as Defend the Village, now christened the Siege of Jeomdo. This video turned out a lot bigger than I expected, and even then it feels like we stripped the story to the basics. There's so much more I could have talked about, and maybe in future videos I will. It's been quite a journey so far. With this dev cycle, we tried to plan things out a little better than last time, but it feels like we still ended up wildly swerving down the winding road that is life, while drunk and speeding. Oh well. At the risk of doxing our friend, Reese is doing well. He's getting into indie filmmaking lately, which is very exciting, just to know he's still doing creative stuff, and we can't wait to see what he comes up with. We hope you enjoyed this peek behind the scenes, and we can't wait to share more of Jeomdo in the near future. Until next time, hip swordsman. There's gotta be a better term for that. I mean, that's better than hipsters, at least. We're not gonna call you hipsters. Before you go, it would mean a lot to us if you kept up with our game dev journey by subscribing to this channel or following us on social media. We're active on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and even TikTok, so pick your poison. If you join our official Discord server, you can gain access to detailed weekly updates and chat to the team about whatever. If you really want to be a homie, the best thing you can do is wishlist the Siege of Jeomdo on Steam. Not only will you be notified when the game releases, you'll help boost our visibility in the algorithm, and every bit counts. Links can be found in the description or our official website.